Here you are again, prepared to turn the page. You know the risk, and know the danger. Let us begin.
Kirby Bridge Park in Kansas City had wonderful walking paths. The city built them wide enough for both walkers and bikers to ride past each other without fear that they would run into one another. The maintenance team kept the concrete level and patched any potholes or cracks. This, and the scenic views of tall beech trees providing shade and a burst of color, made Kirby Bridge one of the top parks in the state. The city named the park after an old footbridge crossing a small stream near the edge of the park's grounds. An old man had slipped on the rocks and hurt himself, so after recovering, he came back to build the bridge. The people loved his tenacity and grit, so when he died at a ripe old age, they put his name on the signs to remember him. The name stuck, and Kirby Bridge Park quickly became a shining gem with well-groomed fields, large trees, and most importantly, its walking paths which crossed over Kirby's Bridge. Elaine had lived near the park almost all her life, but she hadn't gone out much in recent years. Work had kept her busy. Elaine found herself either at home, at work, or driving between the two for most of her waking hours. The sedentary lifestyle had begun taking its toll on her body, and the more she looked in the mirror, the less she liked what she saw. One evening, when she had gotten home from work, Elaine threw her purse down on the kitchen counter, exhausted but resolved. She would make a change that night. If she didn't do it then, she wouldn't ever do it. Moving into her closet, she pulled out a pair of leggings and a loose short-sleeve top that had more dust on them than she would have liked to admit. Yanking the shirt on and pinning her hair back with a band, Elaine took off towards Kirby Bridge Park. The street lights had just begun clicking on when Elaine stepped up to the park's entrance, their soft yellow glows making halos pulling on the sidewalk. She didn't need to run a marathon. She just needed to get out and take that first step. Elaine made a silent promise to walk the small trail that cut through the middle of the park. It had a few curves but almost no hills, and once it made it to the other side, it swept around and came back to the beginning in a sort of badly drawn oval. There was a much longer trail that wound through the trees along the perimeter of the park, but it was for runners and bikers. Elaine didn't kid herself that emergency personnel would have to cart her off the trail if she attempted it. She took a pull on her water bottle and took off. The dark slowly settled around the town, and the sky cut from orange into a vibrant purple. It made the park's lights shine brighter by comparison. They each had a small sensor on the top of which detected the light level, and when it reached a certain point, they kicked on. It was all an automatic process that kept the trail well lit at all times. It was a Wednesday after work when Elaine began her walk, and there were a few others on this shorter trail. They all looked to be clones of her in one way or another. They all had a mix of determination and trepidation spattered across their expressions, Elaine trying to give each one of them a small encouraging smile or a wave as she passed. They were all ahead of her and on the return leg already, or else started from the opposite parking lot on the far side of the park. It took her only 20 minutes to make the loop and then another 5 to trek back home. She was proud of herself as she pulled the now sweaty shirt back off and let it fall to the carpet. Elaine spun the knob on the shower, finished undressing, and climbing into the water, let it rinse off the sweat. She had taken the first step. Everyone said that was the hardest. Elaine climbed into bed after her shower and decided, just before she drifted off to sleep, that she would walk again tomorrow. Weeks came and went, with Elaine fighting through every single walk. She fought to be faster than last time. She fought to get out sooner so she could make 2 laps. And when she finally started running instead of walking, she fought down every single step that wanted her to quit. On Saturdays, she got to run on the longer Boundary Trail. She liked that one better. It had prettier views and fewer people. Elaine had quickly decided that although the companionship of other walkers was welcome on her first trip, they quickly disappeared and others replaced them. It reminded her that there was a quit option, and she didn't need any reminders of that. One Saturday, Elaine hadn't been able to make it to the park during the day like she usually did. Something had come up, a family function, that she couldn't miss. Elaine spent the entire time thinking about the trail and getting away from the constant whirring drone of her relatives. They bickered back and forth in a constant, nagging battle of verbal tug-of-war. The clock ticked over to the second hour, marking the beginning of the socially acceptable time to leave. Elaine didn't disguise her desires. She skipped the 15 rounds of hugs and we'll keep in touches, opting instead to make a mad scramble for the door. She drove home with a constant eye on the clock of her dashboard. If she didn't make it home soon, she wouldn't have the light to do the longer loop. The boundary didn't have any streetlights on it like the main path through the center of the park. It was close, but Elaine made it home, changed, and then to the park with just enough time to make the loop if she hurried. Since hurrying was the whole point of the exercise, she decided to risk the oncoming dark. She really shouldn't have. There were plenty of cars still in the parking lot when Elaine took off onto the trail at a slow, warm-up jog. The larger beech trees flanked both sides of the first curve in the trail, and just behind them, there was a small bridge over the lower end of the stream. This bridge wasn't the Kirby Bridge for which the park held its name, but one of the other, still vital, bridges on the longer trail. Elaine made it around the curves, under the shade of the beech, and across the bridge at record time. It wasn't particularly fast compared with experienced runners, but it was a personal best for her, mostly motivated by the falling light. After the bridge, the trail forked with one way leading into the heart of the park near a pair of well-used tennis courts. The one Elaine wanted, however, split left and transitioned from concrete sidewalk to gravel. The trees here felt closer, and during the hot summer weekends, it was always a pleasant reprieve passing under them. This time, they felt hard, gnarled, and oppressive. It was as though the woods were leaning over the path to suffocate the light from it. The high summer had passed already, and Elaine shivered at the sight. She only hesitated for a second, a quick stutter in her step, and then she was through. On the far side, there was a slow rise that always made her calves ache, but the trees gave her more space. The air felt fresher there after the sudden dark of the copse at the fork. Elaine slowed down at the top of the rise, breathing in the brisk early evening air. She twisted left and right, trying in vain to get rid of a stitch developing in her side. She shouldn't have eaten the cake at the party. There, as she looked out into the heart of the park, Elaine thought she saw something move. It didn't look like the small animals or even a deer that she occasionally spotted. This was a humanoid shape, but only in the barest term. The figure had moved or buzzed, like static on an old television set. At such a distance, she couldn't tell more than that it wore green material across its shoulders, draping down its front and blending it with the foliage behind it. If Elaine hadn't stopped, she would never have seen the thing. It seemed to sense her gaze and rotated towards her in its buzzing way. Even at over 100 yards, the face that looked at her shook her sanity. It was a skull, with empty eye sockets and tears like golden rivers flowing down from them onto its chin. The green cloth draped over a gaunt and ragged form. A whirring sound like a pneumatic catch came from the being, and it vanished. There was no movement, and nothing came between the pair, obstructing each other's view. It simply deleted itself from existence. Elaine blinked and shook her head, refusing to believe what she had just seen had been real. It didn't fit the idyllic park. That thing was a monster out of horror stories. She never was one to believe in ghosts or demons, but that thing, whatever it was, had utterly terrified her. She turned back and headed for the park entrance. There would be no run tonight. Elaine approached the overhanging copse of trees and disregarding any foreboding feeling they had. The creature had her focus now, and the only thing she wanted was to get away from it. She picked up the pace, breathing hard in a quick cadence, matching her steps. The gravel crunched underfoot, but as she passed through the trees into the clearing beyond, she didn't see the forked sidewalk and even lawn of the main park. "What the?" she said, her voice catching in her throat. It sounded odd in her ears, like she was in the stillness of a room filled with heavy fabrics to muffle the sound. It wasn't the sort of sound the open expanse of the park should be making. There were no sounds of birds or insects. The area was deadened. Then, just ahead of her along the right side of the path, the green-cloaked creature blinked back into existence. Elaine jumped a step back. Stay back, she cried, putting her hands out in front of her. The thing was only 30 yards away or so, and Elaine got a much better look at it. She wished she hadn't. It cocked its bone-white head to the side, and Elaine's ears popped as pressure flooded against her. Her skin tingled, her head throbbed, and a red ring formed around the edges of her vision. Stop it, Elaine said, closing her eyes against the pressure despite the danger in front of her. Then, as if someone had opened a valve, the pressure eased. Opening her eyes, Elaine saw no sign of the creature. She did not waste a second looking for it, and instead turned tail and sprinted full out for the park entrance. The sun was lower now, and under the copse of trees, even less light filtered through the ground. Elaine almost tripped twice on the gravel track, but managed to keep her feet. She should have burst out from the edge of the trees after a few seconds, but as she ran faster, the canopy above her seemed to stretch and pull forward like a photographer spinning their lens focus. It dizzied her, and Elaine staggered sideways. She blinked and shook her head to clear it of the oppressive droning noise building up behind her eyes. Finally, she broke free from the tree line, but just as before, Elaine found herself staring at the trail that led deeper into the park. How had she turned around? Was she that disoriented? Had she hit her head? As she looked around the clearing for some hint at what was happening, Elaine felt a soft pull, as though the trees were trying to bring her back to them. She turned to look, leaning away from that pull that tugged at her, slowly increasing in intensity. The creature stood there again. It buzzed again like an old television covered in snowy static, glitching first left and then right. "What do you want?" Elaine asked, and once again it cocked its head to the side. There was no pressure this time. Just a high-pitched whine reverberated through the space between them. It didn't have a mouth, and the golden liquid that oozed from its empty eye sockets dripped off of its chin, staining the front of the green cloak or hitting the ground. "What is it you want?" Elaine asked again, a pleading tone threading through her voice like a splinter. Its voice came from somewhere under that green cloak, sounding robotic and mechanical. Energy. Its words split between two changes in its glitching face. Its tone sounded feminine, like a dark and twisted echo of her own voice. The edges of the monster's profile buzzed more than the rest of its form, giving it an almost outline against the slowly darkening sky behind it. The high-pitched whine intensified, and Elaine clamped her hands over her ears. "Stop that!" she cried. "Please, stop!" Then, without seeming to take a step, the creature blinked forward until it was an inch from her face. She fell backwards, screaming, and put her hands out behind her to break her fall. Instead of gravel cutting into her palms, Elaine felt something soft and cold. She blinked and realized there was snow covering the ground. The creature was gone, and outside of a floating halo of light, Elaine could only see darkness. Elaine rubbed at her shoulders. The snow whirled around her in a pool of light. No matter how hard she looked, there was nothing but a wall of inky blackness outside the snow-filled circle. The whining had stopped, and it was so quiet she could hear the slight tickle of snow as it touched the ground. Her pulse thudded in her chest, quickening against the cold. She would start to shiver soon. Elaine hadn't dressed for a snowstorm. Blowing into her hands to warm them, Elaine noticed her breath did not fog. Then she noticed the circle of light was expanding. It was a slow, subtle thing, but it was glowing. The light pushed back into the darkness, and she felt the wind whistling past her as though she were falling from a great height instead of standing on the ground. Then, like someone flipped a light switch, everything stopped. Everything was still. Elaine couldn't see her hand right in front of her eyes. She couldn't hear her own breathing and couldn't feel the chill of the snow. She was floating in nothingness. Elaine began to breathe faster, stress putting her body on autopilot. She still couldn't hear anything until, as though at a great distance, the robotic voice of a monster called out to her. "Power," it said, the thing's voice cracking like a poisoned whip through the dark. As it spoke, a small green light formed, pulsed once, and then went out. "Let me out! Let me go!" Elaine exclaimed, or so she tried to. She formed the words, but could not hear them. "We must eject to devour," the voice said, this time from behind Elaine. She saw for the briefest second her dark silhouette outlined in a green glow. She spun to look for the creature. "What are you?" she asked. There was a sputter of desperation in her voice. "Why won't you let me go?" "We are here," it said. And this time, after the green glow disappeared, Elaine could see the tiniest pinpoint of light. It slowly widened as though drawing closer from a great distance. One by one, her senses returned to her. It was as though she had slipped out of existence and the creature had deposited her somewhere else. Elaine found herself standing on a barren hilltop. Ash fell around her. It was neither hot nor cold. There were no landmarks anywhere, and once the small rise leveled out, the rest of the place was flat and featureless. She took a step in one direction and realized the small rise was simply an area of tightly packed ash. "What is this place?" she whispered to the surrounding desolation, awe and resignation tightly woven through her tone. The creature blinked into existence before her. Elaine did not flinch or run this time. There wasn't a point. A tear slipped down her cheek. "You have been delivered." it said, its form still buzzing on the edges. The droplets of gold left small craters in the ash heap where they stood. What does that mean? Take me back. I cannot, it replied. Elaine realized the green flash was a small light in the corner of a speaker embedded in the creature's chest. She had been too terrified to notice it before, but now, scared as she was, her focus came in sharper and more rigid. It was this place. Something about it was so alien and different, Elaine's mind couldn't keep up. Why have you brought me here? She asked.
Souls have power.
This time, there was no green light, and the voice came from behind Elaine. This time, it wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't a dark mirror of her own. They weren't alone here. Elaine wanted to turn, wanted to find out who had spoken, what had spoken, but she couldn't move.
You wanted to see me. I see you trying, but unfortunately, the venom works quite quickly. It has frozen your muscles, starting with your arms and legs. Do not worry. It will stop your heart soon enough. The Mortis sends you greetings, and its humble agent gladly accepts your sacrifice.
Elaine couldn't even blink. She could only stare at the green-cloaked creature in front of her. She didn't feel it when something bit off her arm, and the skull stared back at her, dripping golden flecks into the dust that Elaine was soon to join. It didn't move when Elaine's heart stopped. The thing simply stood in a deadly reality the Mortis had already stripped bare. It stood and waited to bring more souls, more power to its creator.
Well, welcome back, Dark Valiants, to Mortis Maledictum. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday in the biting cold and wretched dark. This episode of Mortis Maledictum, Stolen Souls, was narrated by Rosie Knuckles. The voice of Elaine was also Rosie Knuckles. Jeremiah John provided his gravitas to the voice of the agent of the Mortis. This episode was written by Devin McCamey. Audio design was by Lawrence Lyons. Our music and sound effects are thanks to Epidemic Sound, and this episode's bespoke artwork is, of course, courtesy of Brandon McCamey. Thank you for listening, and if you want to find out more about the world of the Mortis Maledictum or to read ahead, visit us on our website, www.mortismaledictum.com. Thank you for listening.
And thus, the story is ended. The tale told. The chapter closed.